Hey students, this is Professor Gore, and this is part three of the Roaring Twenties recorded lecture. Although this third part won't be so roaring, just because it's actually about the stock market crash and Herbert Hoover's presidency, and then a different topic we'll get to FDR and the New Deal. So, with the election of 1928, Herbert Hoover is going to win super easily. The reason why, if the economy is going good, people are happy, the party in power typically stays in power. Coolidge had done a good job of managing, helping the U.S. economy and so forth, and he decides not to run for another term. And Herbert Hoover, who, much like a handful of individuals in American history, was very qualified to be president, kind of like John Quincy Adams, but he's not going to have a successful presidency. Alfred Smith is going to run as a Democratic candidate, but because him being a Catholic, and he kind of had that anti-Catholic sentiment coming out of the 1910s with the revival of the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1920s and nativists and so forth. And then also the other side of the coin is that he had ties to Tammany Hall, which was a corrupt political machine in New York. So anyway, Herbert Hoover is going to win, and but things are not going to go too well for him pretty quickly into office. So let's look at the causes and the effects of the stock market crash and the Great Depression. It's not one singular cause, okay? It's a series of causes that kind of create a perfect storm and then lead to a domino effect of effects. So for 5 years, Americans had spent at a faster pace and their wages and salaries had risen. As soon as consumers ran out of cash and credit, spending declined and housing construction slowed. Soon inventories piled up, and in 1928, manufacturers began to cut back production and lay off workers, reducing incomes and reinforcing the slowdown. By the summer of 1929, the economy was clearly in recession. As speculation ran high, and I'll explain what that is in just a minute. Black Tuesday, or Black Thursday and Black Tuesday, October 24th and October 29th, 1929, hit hard, and stock values fell from a peak of $87 billion to $55 billion. It's a huge plunge in just a matter of 2 days. Agriculture was in the worst shape because farm products sold at low prices throughout the 1920s, and things aren't going to get any better for them in the 1930s until later the New Deal does provide some relief. Because farmers accounted for a fourth of the nation's workers, their meager buying power dragged down the entire economy. Railroads and coal had also fallen on hard times, and a final structural weakness was the unequal distribution of wealth. In 1929, the top 5% of American families received 30% of the aggregate income, while the bottom 50% of American families received only about 20%, most of which was spent on food and housing. So they weren't even consumer spending. Once the Depression began, a majority of the population lacked sufficient buying power to revive the economy, and the Great Crash had a massive social impact. It wiped out the savings of thousands of individual investors because there was no FDIC at that time, and dealt a severe blow to many banks, which had heavily invested in corporate stocks or lent money to speculators. Hundreds of banks failed, and because bank deposits were uninsured, depositors lost some or all of their money. Frightened customers withdrew their savings, which was called a run on the banks, from solvent banks, which responded by closing their doors, thus deepening the crisis. So stock prices are going to plummet. And so this great division of wealth, the buying stocks on the margin, and also farmers hurting economically, and people were overspending from what the wealth that they had, and then they kind of slowed down on spending in 1928. All of that combined helped lead to the stock market crash. Now, let me explain what buying stock on the margin is. It's one of the dumbest things you can do economically, and it's illegal today. But what buying stock on the margin is, all right, let's just use this as an example. Let's say you want to buy stock in Amazon or Apple. Okay, I don't know what the share is trading for right now, but let's say it's $100 a share, okay, just for simple math. All right, so let's say you want to buy 4 shares of Amazon stock, okay, it's $400. Well, you've only got 200, okay? So buying stock on the margin is your stockbroker would go to a bank, get a loan for $200 on behalf of you, okay, it'd be in your name, and then what you would borrow the other 50% of the stock price, And then the assumption is that the stock is going to continue to go up to, $200 a share, and you're going to make that money back and be able to pay back that loan when you sell it, no problem. Okay. So you can see the problems of that, because what if the stock jumps down to $50 a share? Well, now you've only got $200 worth of stock, but you're still $200 in the hole because you borrowed on the margin. So speculation or buying stock on the margin is foolish. But because the stock market was growing so much in the 1920s, obviously they weren't buying stock $100 a share. It was more, more reasonable amounts a share, but it was going up quite a bit. That they thought that they could make their money back no problem. Well, that doesn't happen. And the U.S. gross domestic product fell by almost half, from 103.1 billion to $58 billion. Consumption dropped by 18%, construction by 78%. It was not a good time to be in the construction business. And private investment dropped 88%. Holy cow. Okay. Now, run on the banks, what that was is today your money is backed up by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So next time you go to the bank, look for a gold sign with black lettering, or sometimes it's a black sign with white lettering. It says FDIC, stands for Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. It means your money is protected per account up to $250,000 by the United States Treasury. Now, FDR is going to establish that when we get to the New Deal in the next topic. But back then, your money was not protected. And so let's say a bank had been giving loans out for buying stock on the margin, and somebody wants to pull their money out. Well, let's say they have less cash in the bank than what they say they have in their books because they've lent it out and they haven't been able to get paid back. Well, if people swarm all at once to get their money out of the bank's going to have to collapse and close its doors because it can no longer have any money to stay in business. And that's exactly what happened to a lot of banks. So, for instance, you had about 9,000 banks that went bankrupt or closed their doors, with about 100,000 businesses across the country going out of business. Wow. The consumer price index declined by 25%, and corporate profits fell from $10 billion to $1 billion. That's a 90% plunge. Unemployment rose from 3.2% to a whopping 24.9%. 12 million people were out of work, and many who had jobs took wage cuts. So if you were working, you weren't making near that what you had been previously. Now here's Herbert Hoover, and Herbert Hoover, his view, at the time, he believed in rugged individualism. Okay, he was a very successful businessman in his day, also very successful in government positions. He's actually one of the more talented individuals to have served as president, but Herbert came at the wrong place at the wrong time. So he believed that the government should not provide direct relief. His reasoning was that it made people dependent on the government. Okay. He believed in rugged individualism. Now, what he did believe is that Americans should be very charitable. Now, he was a charitable individual himself, involved in philanthropy as a wealthy businessman. And so he believed that churches and other religious entities and other nonprofits should provide that direct relief. Okay. Not the federal government. And so, because he believed in laissez-faire. So he believed in what's called indirect relief. Okay, now FDR is going to come in and he's going to change things to direct relief. And we'll see that the New Deal is arguably one of the most direct reliefs in American history, along with LBJ's Great Society. So here's all the causes and the effects of it. Okay, I usually would have my high school AP students print this slide out and just have it to study. Okay, so it's not a bad idea to take this slide, just print out just the slide, and then you can use it for studying purposes. Okay. Now, one thing I didn't get to was war debts not being paid back. So basically, American investment banking had lent money to particularly Britain and France during World War I. Okay. You remember the German government had these massive reparation payments brought about by the Treaty of Versailles, and they couldn't really pay it back. Plus, the German economy in the early 20s was terrible. So what they did is they borrowed from the United States. Well, then they would take that money and then pay back their reparation payments. Well, Britain and France got their money back, and then they're paying back American investment bankers who had lent them money during World War One. And so if you look at it, it's just a carousel of money exchange, and nobody's ever really fully getting paid off because just as one person, you rob Peter to give to Paul, so to speak. So that's another cause of the Great Depression. So you look at the uneven distribution of wealth, which is a big problem. Okay, and this is actually a picture of a run on the bank at the time. I've given you some statistics here, but just put it in writing for you. It's crazy how bad things have gotten. I mean, this puts as bad as the Panic of 1893 was. This is worse. Okay, as bad as the Panic of 1837 was. This is worse. Or the Panic of 1873. This is the worst depression in American history. Period. Okay, it is deeper. Unemployment was higher, and it lasts longer than any other depression in American history. Okay. So let's look at this, the domino effect that happens. Okay. So investors lose millions, businesses lose profits. Okay. Well, what happens? Consumer spending drops, business and investment production slow down, workers are laid off, then workers can't spend as much. Okay. Then people can't pay back their loans, banks run out of money and fail. People run on the banks, and then savings accounts are wiped out. Okay, and then you look at the world payments, all that's problems. Okay, so no, it's particularly with the paying back of international debt, it's just a carousel ride. Everybody's just changing, money's changing hands, but nobody's really getting paid off. Now, the Hawley-Smoot tariff, sometimes you'll see it in textbooks as a Smoot-Hawley tariff. It's the same thing. It's just whose name do you put first. Um, the thought was that we got to protect American businesses, so we want Americans to only buy from American companies. So they raised the tariff rate to 60% on the dollar. So that sounds good in theory, but it's actually quite foolish. Kind of like the Embargo Act under Jefferson in the early 1800s. This is foolish because now the countries that we put high tariffs on their goods are going to return the favor and raise our goods up to 6% taxes. So nobody's going to be buying our goods internationally. So then companies can't sell their goods that they need to sell. And then it did not keep prices low for Americans. And so less consumer spending. It's foolish. They needed a basic economics class at the time. So what did Herbert Hoover did? He asked businesses to maintain wages and production levels. So he also wanted to help rebuild Americans' confidence in the capitalistic economic system. The other thing he did is he cut taxes. Okay, and so he also lent money to. I'm sorry. He also called on state and local governments to increase money spent on public works. What's going to happen is FDR is going to change that from the state level to the federal level in the 1933 on when he becomes president. So Hoover wanted states to hire construction workers and build projects and bridges and infrastructure and build parks and so forth, but do it state money, not done with the federal government money. FDR is going to come in and say, no, we're going to do it at the federal level. Now, one thing he does decide to do is the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. It provided federal loans to railroads, financial institutions, banks, and insurance companies. The strategy of pump priming, which was infusing funds into the major corporate enterprises, was designed to increase production and thereby create new jobs and invigorate consumer spending. The plan might have worked, but the RFC was too cautious in lending the money. Some critics say it would have never worked anyways. It kind of really depends on your economic views and some kind of your political views as well. But nonetheless, money was not spent enough in the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to make a dent. So people began to hate Hoover, as you can imagine. And when people began moving in these kind of shanty homeless towns, as they were called, they called them Hoovervilles, named after him. When people had to sleep under newspapers, they called them Hoover blankets. Violence ended up erupting in strikes, people resisting, getting evicted, farmers barricading local roads, etc. In the summer of 1932, the Bonus Army, okay, you can look right here right before FDR takes office, how bad unemployment was. And then we have a double dip recession in 1937. We'll get to that a little bit in just a second. This is actually an auction for a bank foreclosure or farm foreclosure. Okay, obviously, if you had a little bit of money and could buy up businesses, then you could actually become a, potentially a millionaire after the recovery. I had a relative down in Fordyce, Arkansas. They were like second or third cousins of mine. My uncle told me about this. They owned a funeral business in Fordyce, and despite the Great Depression, people still had funerals and people spent money on funerals. So he was one. All these businesses were going under in Fordyce, and they were looking for anybody that could buy it off of them, just so they could, keep their homes. And the funeral director, who was, I guess, a distant cousin of mine, had some cash and was able to buy the businesses. And when World War II happened and the economy turns around, these businesses took off, and they were small town millionaires. And so, if you had some cash flow, you could buy stuff at a really low rate and do really well when the economy rebounds. But unfortunately, that's not usually the case. Most people don't have that kind of cash flow. Um, and you also have big time psychological effects. So I listened to a lecture one time by David Kennedy. He's a history professor at Stanford, wrote a textbook I used to teach out of. Brilliant guy. He's got to meet and advise the president a few times. But he's written kind of considered one of the definitive books on the Great Depression. And he gave a lecture about it in California. And afterwards, a guy came up to him just like sobbing. He's like, "Oh my gosh, I knew I'm talking about the Great Depression, but it wasn't that bad." And so, come to find out, talking about the Great Depression, older gentleman, it really struck a chord. And what had happened was he recounted the story of his father's depression, but his he was a kid. His dad had come home one day, walked upstairs, locked himself in his bedroom, and he and his siblings did not see his dad come out of his room for 2 years, give or take. And he was just crying, thinking about this. What happened with his dad? Well, come to find out from his mom years later, his mom would bring him food, bring her husband food up there. But his dad was in the insurance business and had a successful insurance business. But then when the Great Depression hit, insurance is not one of the things at that time that people kept. And so he was without work and went to a soup kitchen and saw one of his former clients serving him soup. And he was so ashamed that he went home and literally became depressed. And so it's called the Great Depression, both economically, but people were many times legitimately depressed psychologically. And, back then, most of the time, people didn't blame somebody else. They blamed themselves. And they took it very hard on themselves. And it was a difficult time. My grandmother, who survived the Great Depression, she would hide, money in coffee cans because she didn't trust banks. She had a room in the back of her old house, and she was poor. But whenever she'd like go buy a can of spaghetti sauce at the grocery store, she would go in that room and take the oldest can out and then replace it with a new one. And then she would use the old one. And so my dad and I end up loading, when we moved her into a nursing home, a truckload and a half of canned food to the food pantry because some of the stuff had expired. We had to get rid of it. We probably had 2 truckloads if it wasn't for that. But she would have outlived us if there had been an economic calamity because she had food. She stockpiled food for bad times because she grew up in the Great Depression. Now, before Herbert Hoover leaves office and he is running for re-election in 1932, these World War I vets were promised some bonuses, but it was supposed to come years later, like 20 years after the war. And so instead of 1938, they wanted it in 1932. And so they were called the bonus army and so forth, but they were about 15 to 20,000. We don't know how many. A lot of them hitchhiked to Washington because they won their bonuses now. But Hoover had told General Douglas MacArthur that, you need to get them to leave their camp because they set up on the Capitol grounds and so forth. But when the marchers refused, Hoover called out regular Army troops under the command of Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur was not authorized to do this, and MacArthur was a prick. He burned the encampment to the ground, and in the fight that followed, injured more than 100 marchers, particularly the tear gas, hurt some children and so forth. And so Hoover wasn't going to win re-election. That's pretty certain. But his popularity plunges even further. Okay. And so this is a picture of the bonus marchers. This is them camped out, and that's it burning down. You can see the Capitol sticking up in the background. Hoover's Poor Farm Tobacco Fund. Hard times are still hoovering over us. And this is the political cartoon saying that Hoover's in over his head. All right. Now, to go back, let's talk about the election of 1932, and then we will get to FDR's presidency when we get to the New Deal recorded lecture. But many middle-class Americans really kind of internalize this self-made man, rugged individualism. And so the Democrats turned to Governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who's one of our more popular presidents in American history. And he had persuaded New York State Legislature to run up budget deficits to finance innovative relief and unemployment programs. And that's exactly what he's going to do at the federal level when we get to the New Deal. He was disabled. He had a crippling attack of, it was actually not polio. They called it polio for decades, but he had a rare strain of an adult form of polio. What polio is a disease that affects your nervous system, and he was his legs were paralyzed for life. And until Jonas Salk convinced the vaccine in the 1950s, it affected a lot of kids. Eleanor, his wife, was a big component of him getting back into politics and campaigned for him. Roosevelt's going to win the 1932 election very easily, but he will not take office till March of 1933. So Congress, one of the things that they passed is they moved up the presidential inauguration from March to January. Now it's 6 weeks between the election day and when a president comes into office. And the goal is to end that lame duck time period when a president is voted out of office and they're leaving office. And so the nation during that time of the lame duck period was suffering through the worst winter of the Depression, with Toledo, Ohio having 80% unemployment. Public welfare institutions were totally overwhelmed. And despite dramatic increases in their spending, private charities and public relief agencies reached only a fraction of the needy. And by March of 1933, the nation had hit rock bottom. We're going to talk about how the New Deal is going to get the United States to tread water. It's not going to get the country out of the Great Depression, but it's not going to sink into socialism or collapse. But World War II, after that, is what's going to bring the country into one of the great economic periods in American history, where 60% of the country is going to end up being the middle class in the decades after World War II. And we'll stop there.